will be introduced by Mary Michael Corbett, retired Executive Director of Baptist Health Foundation. She's a former board member of the Rotary Club, Speakers Committee member for a long time. She's been really dedicated and helped us a lot, and a Paul Harris Fellow. Welcome, Mary Michael.
Thank you, President Julie, and hello, Rotarians. It's great to be with you today, and a pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Tanya Abelin is the Vice President for Corporate Communications at Churchill Downs Incorporated. She is also the President of the Churchill Downs Foundation. Her professional career has taken her from Chicago to Los Angeles, where she managed events for luxury hospitality group Viceroy Hotels, executing events for celebrity, entertainment, and fashion brands before returning home to her beloved state of Kentucky to fulfill her dream of working with the greatest 2 minutes in sports. She is the proud and, as she says, exhausted mother of 2 sons, Luke and Todd, ages 7 and 4, active ages for sure. Her husband, Chris, is one of Baptist Health's highly respected orthopedic surgeons. Shameless shout out for my former employer. If you don't know Tanya, she is a force of nature. She meets every challenge with enthusiasm and optimism, and she is a fashionista at heart. But perhaps most importantly, she's been the ideal ambassador for Churchill Downs the last 2 years, from the 2019 maximum security disqualification, the 2020 COVID reschedule, and ultimately spectator-free Kentucky Derby, to this year's impending winning results, which we're all anxious to learn. Join me in welcoming Tanya to Rotary.
Wow, thank you so much, Mary Michael. You are someone who I just admire so much, and I appreciate the liberties you took with that bio. Now I'm beginning a little emotional because I appreciate so much those words. And it's such an honor to join such a distinguished group of business and civic leaders. And I want to thank, first of all, the Rotary Club of Louisville for allowing me to address you today, but mostly for all you've done and continue to do for our community. I see so many people as I scroll through Zoom that I recognize and I admire so much. So it's a real honor and a privilege to get to join you today, albeit virtually, hopefully in person soon. So yes, today I wanted to talk to you about something that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, which is the Kentucky Derby. You know, I take it for granted that everyone is as interested in the Derby as I am. And I know in Louisville, we're so fortunate that there is that interest and awareness. And I'm sure some of you could actually present this for me, and I would learn a lot about the place that I work from you. And I think that's what's so special about the Derby is everyone feels a little bit of ownership in it. And I also want to talk about beyond that, some of the growth that's taking place at Churchill Downs Incorporated. I know originally Bill Karstanjian, our CEO, had hoped to be a part of this, and some responsibilities took him elsewhere today. But I know that that's probably likely what he would have addressed and something that you may be interested in hearing. And I always think that it's interesting how much people locally, as engaged as they are with the Derby and with Churchill Downs as a location, don't always know what Churchill Downs Incorporated, the company, is doing and sort of what our growth metrics are and what the future looks like for us. So I'll touch on that a little bit toward the end. But as of now, we are about a month and a half past the 147th running of the Kentucky Derby. And as Mary Michael mentioned, there is a lot about that race that still remains in the headlines. And I'll address some of that. But immediately following the race, before we knew what was to come with those results, so many people reached out to me and said, it must have felt so good to have a normal Derby again. And that was interesting to me because this Derby didn't necessarily feel normal to me at all. Of course, it returned to the first Saturday in May, its rightful place on the calendar. We were able to welcome back a limited number of spectators. Just for comparison, we had approximately 52,000 people in attendance for the Kentucky Derby this year at Churchill Downs, compared to the usual 160,000 roughly on a good weather year. And actually, just as an aside, this is going to be a problem for us because unanimously, for those who came to the Derby this year in person, they much preferred the smaller crowd. No one hesitated to admit how much they enjoyed, shorter lines and more space. And it didn't feel polite to tell them at the time not to get used to it, because we do intend to go back to full capacity. So that'll be a challenge next year when some folks aren't happy to have some of that space. But also, the reason it didn't feel normal to me this year, more than all of those factors, is that leading to this year's Derby, the city didn't feel, it felt as if it was still in a wait and see mode. And all of that had to do with the uncertainties surrounding COVID. And without some of the usual festivities and the excitement that usually happens throughout our city, it lost a little bit of the magic, a little bit of the spark that leads up to Derby, where everyone feels like they're contributing and they have a part of this massive celebration in our city. And I have to note, to be clear, there's nothing normal at all about getting two of the most glorious days in terms of weather for both Oaks and Derby that we will likely ever again get in our lifetimes. And if you've been to the track on Derby weekend, you know what I mean. One of those 2 days, you're going to get pelted with rain. And this year, it was just two of the most glorious and beautiful days you could imagine. But it made me think about what a normal Derby looks like and what that means to us, both at Churchill Downs and as community members in the city of Louisville. And I think for those of us in the city, it means most likely being able to participate in those traditions that give us comfort and that provide a reference to us of where we are in the cycle of the year. As you know, the social calendar in the city of Louisville very much exists on a before Derby and an after Derby cycle. So, that the Derby just sort of helps us calibrate and know where we are in the year. And this year it didn't really feel that way. And it's been a while since we've experienced, I think, what we would classify at Churchill Downs as a classically normal Derby year. And it all reminded me, I thought of this a lot throughout 2020, this Chinese proverb that says, "May you live in interesting times." And those words at one time in my life felt like an exciting fortune. But now, in terms of my work, and as I'm sure everyone emerges from the pandemic, it starts to feel a little bit like a curse. Like maybe this is a little too interesting for me. And all of that started when I assumed the role as Vice President of Corporate Communication in 2019, just before that Derby season. I remember standing in the winner's circle in the pouring rain, of course. It was 2019, and I was witnessing up close the confusion of that Derby disqualification. And I remember seeing, and again, I don't have the benefit of watching this on television and hearing the commentary, and so it's all very confusing when you're watching it unfold in real life. And I saw someone just quite literally, strip roses out of the hands of the connections of maximum security, usher them out of the winner's circle, and in comes a new set of folks with Country House. And of course, now we know, at least I hope we do. I do think looking back that there wasn't a good amount of communication about that. And there's a reason. Now that I've been in this role a little bit longer, I understand it. But I also think we did a disservice to our fans and to the general public by not explaining in greater detail what had happened, why it had happened. You can be assured that I took a lot of unhappy and in some cases very nasty voicemails in the weeks following, accusing Churchill of all kinds of conspiracy theories. But of course, we now know that the stewards that represent the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission, which is the regulatory body for all of racing in Kentucky, including the Kentucky Derby, that ruled that maximum security, the horse that crossed the finish line first, had caused interference in the race by veering out into another lane. And I think that all of that is certainly still debatable in the court of public opinion. But what I was proud of in that moment, despite it being confusing and a little bit scary, is that this rule exists for the safety of the horses and for the jockeys, for the athletes of the sport. And so I was proud that we were now acknowledging to the public there are rules to protect these horses. There are rules to protect the jockey athletes. And even though we don't all understand them, and even though sometimes they're not as clear as we would like them to be, these professionals who are trained to determine this have made a ruling, as unpopular as it may be, in protection of these horses. So that was the piece of it that felt really positive to me that I don't think a lot of people were talking about, because there was a lot of silence following that. And of course, as you know, in today's age, there is the presumption of litigation in a case like that. And so people automatically feel silenced in preparation for what may or could be held against them in the court of law. And so looking back, I understand that was what was at play. But I do wish that there had been a better public explanation for what had happened. I was just as confused as anyone in many cases. But I remember thinking the ending to that Derby would have to be the most unique of my career. Like, I would be telling stories someday about my very first Derby in this role, and, you know, what a doozy it was, and it only get easier after that. And I actually said that out loud. I'm afraid I put it into the universe. I said, it can only get easier after this. And I'm sure many of you, especially many of you on this Zoom and members of the Rotary Club of Louisville, may remember that that was our first Derby that we had to run without the benefit and wisdom of the late, great John Asher. And so typically in a situation like that, John would take center stage, and he would explain in the way that only he could, in the way that everyone would understand. He would give that comfort. And so the absence of him, I think, also played a part in just sort of that fear of those of us who didn't know how to move forward without him, looking at each other and not knowing how to handle something like this. And I think of him often, absolutely every day, as I'm sure many of us do who were lucky enough to call him a friend. And I don't pray to John Asher, but I do summon his spirit and ask for guidance. And but lately I look up and I shake my head, and I even scold him a little. And I think, you've got a really sick sense of humor, my friend, messing with the Derby this way. I'm sure he's greatly entertained at what has transpired over the years since we've lost him. And now that the 2021 Derby win is in question, I get asked a lot, how is what's happening now different from what happened in 2019? For example, I think what they're mostly wanting to understand is, in 2019, if you had placed a wager on Country House, which was the horse that crossed the finish line second, but was ultimately declared the winner of that Derby, you were still able to cash that as a winning ticket after the disqualification happened. And so now I'm approached by a lot of people who wonder, if they had placed a wager on Mandaloun, which was this year's second place finisher, if Medina Spirit is eventually disqualified as the winner, will they be able to collect a winning bet on Mandaloun? And the answer to that is no. And is one of the many reasons why this situation is so unfortunate. But the reason for that is there's actually a regulation under the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission that says, once a race is declared official by the stewards of the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission, the wagers are paid out and they cannot be reversed at that time. So in the case of 2019, the stewards started investigating that interference right away. And therefore that race was never declared official. So if you've been to the track, any race, you know that there's always that period of time where they say, hold your tickets. And then eventually you'll get the all clear, this race is declared official and you can cash your winning tickets. And so the declaration that the race was official never happened in 2019. It did in 2021. So what that means is no matter what happens, from here on out, the wagers are final and cannot be reversed. So when will we know who the winner of Kentucky Derby 147 is? And so what happens now in the case of Medina Spirit and Bob Baffert, I hear a lot of people asking, what takes so long? Why is this taking so long? And it is admittedly confusing and a bit convoluted. So I wanted to talk through it a little bit today, even though, as I said before, I'm sure many of you understand, as you probably have a elevated knowledge of the race than some others may. But you probably read that Medina Spirit failed a drug test when a prohibited substance was detected in a blood sample. So that blood sample was taken right after the Derby race was complete, and it's customary for every race. Those blood samples are drawn, they're tested for certain substances that are prohibited. But we don't get those results right away. The results go to a lab, and it takes some time to get them back. And so about a week after the race, we learned of the positive and Medina Spirit. And at that point, the trainer of the horse has the option to request a second test on a split sample. And so what that means is, you know, a second blood sample is taken at the exact same time, and it's stored in case of an event like this. So many people ask, it's a very logical question. I asked it myself when I first heard about this. Why don't you test before the race instead of after, so that if a horse is positive, you could prohibit them from racing in the first place, and we wouldn't have this issue of disqualification or potential disqualification in this case. So great idea, right? But like most things, it's more complicated than that, and logic isn't always the master here. One is it takes so long to get the results. So, you know, if we were to test the horses that morning, we still wouldn't have the results by the time the race ran. But the other and more complicated piece of that is that, you know, in this case, the prohibited substance that was revealed in Medina Spirit's test isn't actually a banned drug. It's a legal therapeutic medication for horses, but it's not supposed to be in their system on race day. And so in Kentucky, for that particular medication, we call for a 14-day withdrawal period. So that means the horse should not be administered that medication 14 days prior to the race. But if we were to test the horses the week leading to the race, there is a chance that the substance could still appear in their bloodstream legally, because horses may metabolize, you know, medication differently. So we determine the withdrawal period, but within that 14 days, it could still show up in the bloodstream. But, you know, between a trainer and a vet, they have to determine when to discontinue so that it does not show up in the system on race day. And the reason that it is a legal medication but not allowed in the system on race day is it's not technically a performance enhancing drug. I think that's what a lot of people suspect when they hear failed a drug test, that there was some sort of performance enhancing or illicit drug in the system, and that's not the case. This particular medication is fine to treat horses under the prescription of a vet, but if a horse needs that to treat pain, we don't really want them to be racing, because racing on an injury that's masked with a medication like this is how horses get critically hurt, and we don't want that. So again, this is a rule, a regulation that's in place for the safety of the horse. So we now know that the split sample was tested, and that Medina Spirit revealed the same overage of the medication in that split sample. So what happens now is the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission will schedule a hearing with the horses' trainers and owners. And at the conclusion of that hearing, the regulatory body, not Churchill Downs, will determine whether to invalidate the results of the race and disqualify Medina Spirit as the winner of the Kentucky Derby. And at that time, they will assess any penalties or suspensions that they feel is necessary or that are mandated under those regulations. And following that, there can be a series of appeals that can happen. So just to give you an idea, the last and the only other time that something like this happened was in 1968 to a horse named Dancer's Image. And it took 4 years for that appeals process to run its entire course before it was irreversibly disqualified. And I'm told through historians that in that appeals process, there was a point where the disqualification was actually overturned. So Dancer's Image was named the winner again. And then an appeal after that was lost. And ultimately, Dancer's Image was disqualified. So I hope to goodness that we are not looking at something like that this year. I have no way of knowing if that's what's in our future. But I think that's fascinating. And, you know, my head goes to the really superficial things like, you know, derby glasses that may have different winners on it for the same year. I'm always looking for a reason, you know, to find a collectible derby glass. And this could be it if something like this happens. So Churchill Downs, along with the rest of you, are awaiting the date of that hearing and the results of that. But there are many reasons why, you know, obviously why this is unfortunate. And one that I noticed recently is, you know, obviously it's not great for public confidence for people who wager on horses. And I noticed after the Belmont this weekend, there was a headline that read, "Essential quality crosses the finish line first in Belmont." And what that told me is that they wanted to acknowledge that something could change. So this horse crossed the finish line first, but they stopped short of declaring that horse the winner of the Belmont. And that saddened me because I thought, this isn't what we want horse racing to be, is, something that people just don't have the confidence in the results after they've happened. So as a company, how do we change that? As a company, Churchill Downs was pleased last fall that a federal bill was passed called the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act. We call that HISA around here. And what that act will do is, when it takes effect in July 2022, it will create a national governing body for horse racing. Some people are surprised to hear that this is an industry, one of the only remaining sports that does not have such a national governing authority. And this governing body will establish a uniform standards and rules for horse racing across the entire country, instead of the current situation, which is each state sort of operates its own racing jurisdiction. And in some cases, they have different rules and regulations. So luckily and finally, it's time for us to usher horse racing into the future. We're incredibly supportive of the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act, and we're hopeful that this will minimize situations like we find ourselves in now. So when I talk about living history through the Derby, I do have to at least address the Kentucky Derby in 2020, which is sometimes painful to do. And I won't spend a lot of time there because I'm not certain that many of us can take much more of 2020 talk. And as I look back on that year, a few things stick out to me. One is, as I was cleaning up my email inbox at the end of last year, I found something that was actually shocking to me, many months after the fact. And that was at the end of February in 2020 is when I first started to receive media inquiries asking how I thought the coronavirus might impact the Derby. And I'm embarrassed to tell you that there was an email chain in my inbox of me forwarding those inquiries to colleagues and almost laughing about it and saying, what a stretch that they're trying to connect, this something that's happening across the globe to our event. It seems like clickbait. It seems like an unfair connection. And lo and behold, 2 weeks later from that first media inquiry, we were announcing a new Derby date in September. And we were confident at that point that we could host a Derby in September full of spectators. And so it was shocking to me to look back, at how much we've all learned in the past year, how confusing it was to us in the beginning, but just how quickly things changed again. And how many times last year, I said that we really planned 3 Derbies in 2020. We planned the first Saturday of May. We postponed that. We planned a Derby full of spectators. And then eventually we ended up running a Derby that was spectator free. And, I can now say that was an incredibly depressing day for me. As happy as I was that we could still keep up the great tradition of the Derby and that those 3-year-old horses still had their chance to run for the roses, to be at Churchill Downs on Derby Day without the energy of spectators was something I hope I never have to experience again. It was really, really eerie and not the way the Derby should be experienced at all. But changing that date, we held out for so long and we did get a little bit of public criticism about that. And I remember feeling that pressure, like we need to communicate, we need to tell people something. And it wasn't a decision that we took lightly. I mean, of course, there were a lot of operational issues that had to be worked out and that we wanted to get right before we announced a new date. Some of that was contingent on our broadcast partner, NBC, and working out, a time slot where we could be on television. And as you know, ultimately, we abandoned the idea that we could keep the Triple Crown in its rightful order. And so, we ended up being the second leg of the Triple Crown instead of the first. But we also knew that this would have a massive impact on local businesses and our tourism industry. And, now that I step out of that pressure a little bit, I realize that it wasn't, Churchill Downs' decision about the Kentucky Derby that had that impact. Obviously, it was a global pandemic of which we had no control, but I think we take that very seriously. Is our responsibility to the city and the local businesses who rely on the Derby, economically for business. And so that was very, very hard for us. And we've often said that we don't own the Derby. It belongs to all of us. And we merely get the great privilege of hosting it at Churchill Downs Racetrack. And I truly believe that to be the case. But I've always said that the greatest stories of the Kentucky Derby are those that recount the triumph against improbable odds. And I think that's what we've done as a city and a community, and that's what we were able to do last year. And so for that reason, it will live on as a beautiful memory, albeit a challenging one. And our intent is always to provide, to our fans, our community, our country, hope. And that's something that we wanted to do last year too, is just represent hope for everyone. We aspired to create an opportunity for people to look forward to something, to an event that would unite us in what was incredibly uncertain times. And for me and for our team members at Churchill Downs, the Kentucky Derby is the essence of what this company does. And putting it on every single year is the most important contribution that we make as individuals and as a group to our community and the city. And it's a labor of love that feels like a true obligation to our fellow Kentuckians. And we feel immense pride about what it brings to our Commonwealth. And so, when we hear, like we did in 2020, that there are people in our community who feel like the Derby isn't for them, or they don't feel like they have a connection to the Derby, or they don't feel like they have access to the economic opportunities that the Derby brings to our community, we took that very seriously. And so those learnings have led to a lot of changes in the way we operate, all very exciting, all meaningful and important. We were able to announce the Derby Equity and Community Initiative in partnership with the Kentucky Derby Festival, and we'll be kicking that off next year. And I think you'll see some notable changes in the way that we present events leading to Derby to our community, in the hopes that everyone has access to that hope, that magic, the opportunity that Derby brings to the city. And so while any story about Churchill Downs as a company will always start with that, that 2-minute race that started in 1875, the growth of the company has been really exponential in recent years. And as I said before, I'm always surprised at people in our city who aren't aware of some of the other segments of Churchill Downs. And we've grown into a publicly traded company, in addition to several horse racing tracks that we own. Churchill Downs Incorporated, we call it CDI here. So CDI has expanded to own 16 regional casinos and historical horse racing properties around the country. And we are an industry leader in online gaming and wagering. So many of you may be familiar that in 2007, we created the technology platform called TwinSpires. I always say when I see my husband, like professionally, I'm so proud of that product and how it brings horse racing into your home and gives people access to experience racing, especially in 2020 when people couldn't leave their homes, and horse racing was one of the only sports that could continue safely. So we were able to gain a new audience that way. Then when I look over and I see my husband on his TwinSpires account, I think, oh gosh, we've made this too easy. This is too easy. So, but due to that, it is the most profitable online wagering platform in the U.S. And it is, of course, still used for mobile horse race wagering, but also now for sports betting and iGaming in states where it's legal to do so. So here, as I'm in Kentucky, I couldn't pull up TwinSpires and access the sports betting or the iGaming component. That's not legal to do in the state of Kentucky, but in other surrounding states it is. So that's been interesting to see that platform grow into those areas. And I think one of the segments that may not be as familiar to others and create some confusion, you may have seen it in the headlines this past year, is historical horse racing. So in Kentucky, we say we have live horse racing and historical horse racing. So what does that mean? And it's still fairly new for us at Churchill Downs, an incredibly important part of our business now, and it is incredibly important to live racing and our ability to keep live racing strong in Kentucky. We entered the market in 2018 when we opened Derby City Gaming on Poplar Level Road. even though historical horse racing had been in legal operation in Kentucky for about a decade at that time, through other companies. And we have Derby City Gaming on Poplar Level Road, as I mentioned. We opened Oak Grove Racing, Gaming, and Hotel in Oak Grove, Kentucky. When we purchased Turfway Park in Northern Kentucky, which is currently under renovation, we opened Newport Racing and Gaming, which is also in Northern Kentucky. So those are the historical horse racing facilities that are currently operational. And, you know, I get asked a lot, what is a historical horse racing machine? And it is a gaming device. And when you walk into those properties, it does not look unlike what you might imagine a slot machine looks like. But the results of when you play this game, the results are based on previously run horse races. And so, you know, you'll walk in, it actually shows the date of the horse race that the results are based on. There's no wagering involved, but the results are based on the results of that horse race. So it's really interesting. And what we've been able to do with that segment of the business is we've been able to bolster purses for our live horse races. So for example, the revenue generated at Derby City Gaming goes into the purses that we give at Churchill Downs Racetrack. And we've been able to increase those so much over the past few years, thanks to historical horse racing, not to mention the thousands of jobs that the industry has brought to the state of Kentucky in an investment. But it allows us to still attract the best horses, you know, the best jockeys, the best trainers, because now with increased purses, they want to come run in Kentucky. And there was a time pretty recently where that was in question, where people were starting to race more in New York and California. When we think about horse racing as a premier industry of Kentucky and one that we want to preserve, and all of the jobs that come with it, and not just people who work for Churchill Downs, but people who make feed for a living, people who train. You know, there's so many industries in this state that is contingent on the success of horse racing. And so historical horse racing has really allowed us to continue to do that. And so for that reason, it's incredibly important. But I just wanted to take some time to talk through it, because I know for some people it's not second nature like live racing. And I know we're coming up on the end of our time, but I just wanted to finish by saying that despite all of that growth in the company, and despite how the company may look like it's changing sometimes to the public, or especially to locals who remember it as, you know, just some people at a racetrack in South Louisville, the Kentucky Derby and horse racing is always at the heart of what we do, and it always will be. And so when I think about the heart of anything, I think of my favorite Derby story, one that makes me feel connected to my job and is one of the reasons, sort of my North Star every single day. And it's one of the reasons I always dreamed of moving back to Kentucky and working for Churchill Downs and the Kentucky Derby. So if you'll indulge me in sharing it with you, I think it was the turn of the century, and I was watching with my dad. I still lived at home in Monticello, Kentucky. It's a small town in South Central Kentucky. I never thought I'd ever even get to go to the Derby, much less work for Churchill Downs. And we were watching a countdown. At the time, they were doing all of these countdowns, the best of the century, the best of the decade. And they were doing a countdown on ESPN called The Best Athletes of the Millennium. And I was watching with my dad, and you know, they get through the top 10, and they had already named all of the usual suspects. They'd already, you know, talked about Michael Jordan. They'd even, number 2, talked about Muhammad Ali. And that's who I expected to be first. So of course we have that Louisville connection. And I remember thinking, gosh, who else is left? They've gone through everyone I can imagine as the best athlete of the millennium. And lo and behold, number 1 was not a human, but it was a horse, and it was Secretariat. And it was not until then, I always knew Secretariat was, you know, indisputably the greatest thoroughbred horse race of all time. And I love that picture of him finishing the Belmont first to win the Triple Crown in 1977, because you can't even see the other horses in the picture. He's that far ahead. So I knew he was the greatest horse, but I didn't know until this countdown documentary that upon the passing of Secretariat, they discovered that his physical heart was 2.5 times the size of your average thoroughbred racehorse. And of course, there's all kinds of scientific reasons why that made him a great athlete because he could, due to the size of that heart, he took in more oxygen, he turned it into energy, and that's why he could race, run so much faster than the others. But what that said to me in that moment is that when you run with your heart, you will always be a champion. And so that's always the way that I try to make decisions in my world at Churchill Downs, is to operate from the heart. And I know that that's what so many of you do as great contributors to this community, is making decisions with our heart. Sometimes it's not the most logical, but it will always, you'll always be a champion when that's how you, when that's your North Star. And so that's why Secretariat will always represent the greatest to me for that reason, not because he's a Triple Crown winner, not because he still holds the fastest time, but because he ran with his heart. And that is all I have. Thank you for your attention. Of course, with Zoom, you're all on mute, so you may not have been paying attention. I would have no way of knowing, but
you did a wonderful job, and everybody joined me in applauding. We just really appreciate your time and what you shared with us today. And would you have time for a few questions? Or
absolutely. Okay. Yeah, I'd love that.
Great. I'm really glad you shared about the purses, because, unless you kind of really knew about that industry, you might not realize we were in a really bad shape here and not able to attract the kind of, successful horses like you mentioned. So with those tracks that contribute that purse, is it just by that region, or is it all of it comes back? How does that work?
So it's just in that region. So for example, when the regulations passed for historical horse racing, they allowed for you to have what they called an annex within 60 miles of the racetrack itself. And so for Churchill Downs, that's Derby City Gaming. And so those purses bolster, or those revenues bolster purses at Churchill Downs Racetrack. For Turfway Park in Northern Kentucky, it will be that Newport Racing and Gaming Annex that I mentioned. Oak Grove doesn't have thoroughbred racing, they have standardbred racing. And so the revenues there go to the standardbred purses, which was also a really cool thing for Kentucky to be able to start to build that standardbred industry. Everyone's familiar with thoroughbred, but for standardbreds as well, it was an important opportunity. And then at Keeneland, you have Red Mile. And so tracks across the country have their own annex, and the success of those brings success to that racetrack.
Very good. Thank you for sharing about that. Robert, I see you had a question out of the gate. Would you like to unmute and ask your question to Tanya?
Sure. Thank you. It was a great talk, and we do miss John, of course. I do remember him. I'm in California now. But the question real quick is, we want to, from California, I've been to the Derby before, but we want to go back with friends. And any recommendations on travel companies or folks that, for people to get packages for 2022?
Yes, and that is a really great question, Robert, because I'm always surprised at what a mystery it still is, even locally, on how do you get tickets to the Derby. And I think even as an insider, it's never an easy or simple answer. But for you, I have a much easier answer. We have an official a travel package company called Quint Events. And so they have a website called derbyexperiences.com. And what I say is that is the most turnkey, and that's a separate company from us. We contract with them and we give them inventory for tickets, good tickets, but it's the easiest turnkey way. I mean, Quint Events through Derby Experiences, they will take care of your hotel, your travel, any extra dining experiences. If you want to go to some of the fun Derby parties, they can build that into the package. They make it so easy. And especially I would imagine for someone traveling from out of town, although I know you're familiar with Louisville, but sometimes you just want to make one phone call and be done with it. And I would say Quint Events, derbyexperiences.com is unquestionably the most reliable and the one that we partner with and endorse. So we know that they have access to good tickets and you'll be well taken care of.
Thank you.
Chris Whalen, she touched a little on this, but could you ask your question?
Sure thing. Thank you. Tanya, thank you so much for being here. Such great information. And I really love the run with your heart encapsulating, finishing with that and encapsulating the whole Derby spirit. It's fantastic. So the question, yes, was saw the announcements around Derby time about appointing Catherine Armstrong to VP of Culture and the DEI commitment. And it's near and dear to our own heart. We have the same commitment at Rotary. So first, just want to say applause to Churchill Downs for that commitment. You did speak a little bit to saying, okay, you're going to see some activities, on the horizon next Derby. And it may be too soon for any other details, but do you have anything else about some diversity initiatives?
Yes, absolutely. And I love talking about this. So thank you for asking. It was a very exciting announcement for us. We announced the hiring of a new vice president of culture. Her name is Catherine Armstrong. She comes to us from Atlanta. And, even though up until that point of hiring her and identifying her as a professional, we had formed some really important partnerships in the community. We have two major announcements that'll be coming up probably in the next month that I'm really excited about. And those are important. That investment in the community is important in making sure that as a responsible corporate citizen, we, our commitment is equitable and diverse. And, prior to 2020, if I were to quote to you our charitable strategy, it would have said something like, we support the arts in our community and women's health initiatives, all of which are still so important and that we still support. But last year, we changed our entire giving strategy to support organizations that reduce inequalities. And I love that that's general, because that can be health, you all know, health, education, affordable housing. And so we've really been exploring those. So that's ongoing and will continue to grow. With Catherine, what's interesting about this is I look back at Churchill Downs as a company, and a lot of it predates me. But of course, you have what was this very niche business of horse racing. And, for the longest time, it got the reputation of being almost this good old boys club of like, we're just promoting from within, and people who have been in the industry or families that are in the horse racing industry sort of get the opportunities. And I don't know if that's true and I don't know if it's not, but it certainly makes sense if that was the case. What happened is Churchill Downs experienced that rapid growth so quickly when Twinspire started in 2017. And I've given this a lot of thought, because if there was so much confusion here of like, what happened? How did we get this wrong? How did we miss the mark here? And I look back to that and I see there was this rapid growth, and there was lots of attention on growing this company, and for all the right reasons, like that's what a business is supposed to do. And the culture of this small business was lost in that rapid growth. And, there wasn't someone keeping a handle on that. And what I've seen when I'm out in the community is that for a lot of people locally, there was this feeling that Churchill Downs Incorporated forgot about the community locally, because we're buying properties all over the country. We're a publicly traded company. We're talking about our investors a lot. And again, all things that are important to a business. And so it's not anyone's fault. I think it's a result of that rapid growth. What I'm proud of is that, Bill Carstangen, our CEO, noticed there was something missing and had the courage to admit it. And with the hire of Catherine, we're really starting to fix that. And so really what she's working on now, you might not see her publicly that much at first, because what she's working on now is the internal culture. So we want the DNA of this company to reflect what the community expects of us. And while we may lack diversity, we're not getting it right when it comes to hiring. And so we're going to make efforts in that regard. But also retention. Are we creating a culture here where people feel welcome and they feel like their contributions, are celebrated? And we want to make sure we're getting that right. And we know the rest, that what comes after that will be beautiful and important and meaningful, but it's so important to get that right. And so that work is happening, and it's been interesting. And there's been a lot of growth and change internally in the last year, all really good. But just the awareness that was missing. And, I don't think it was probably just us, that experience. I think a lot of businesses sort of experienced that over the last year. But, I started to think for Churchill Downs as this institution, we almost have a bigger responsibility than maybe some other businesses, in that people feel so connected to the Derby and Churchill Downs. And so they expect more of us, and they want to be proud of us. And when they don't feel that way, they're vocal about it. And so we are responsible for making them proud. And so that's part of our journey now.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Tanya, thanks again for sharing a wonderful presentation with us. We appreciate it so much. And please come back again and We just are grateful for the wonderful work that Churchill Downs is doing, not only for the company and for your shareholders, but for all of us in the community and for our great state. So thank you so much.
If you will have me, it would be my delight. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yes. Reminder, everyone, if you want to, you can probably feel it. You know, the applause is so weird through Zoom, but we really appreciated your presentation.
Thank you.
A reminder to everyone, we're going to be back in person the next 2 weeks. We're going to take out June and hopefully forevermore in person. We're going to be at the River House, Savor at River House. It's right upstairs, easy access. Dr. Jason Chesney will be our speaker. And we also want to make sure that you sign up for these great business networking events with Tom Owen next Tuesday. The weather looks fantastic. So as Sandra shared earlier, that is a memorable opportunity. So take it if you haven't done that before, and sign up. Rotarians, mark your calendars for that Repair Fair Saturday, June 26th. Again, thank you all so very much for being with us, and an appreciation for Jim for sharing his talent, and Barbara Collins, the chair of our music committee, for helping make that possible. Everyone, be well, and I look forward to seeing you next week. We're adjourned.